The night was quiet. Too quiet. The dim glow of streetlights flickered over the empty sidewalks, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted with every passing second. A cold breeze whispered through the trees, carrying with it a sense of unease, as if the city itself could sense something was coming. Miles Carter walked alone, his footsteps steady, his posture relaxed but alert. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, he looked like any other man heading home after a long day. But beneath that calm exterior was a force few could ever comprehend. Miles wasn't just an ordinary man. He was a former Navy SEAL, trained to survive, trained to fight, trained to end threats before they even knew what hit them. Just a few miles away, danger was already on the move. 4 prisoners had broken out of a nearby maximum security prison, slipping past the guards and vanishing into the night. They were desperate, dangerous, and ready to do whatever it took to stay free. Their faces were plastered all over the news, armed, violent, and unpredictable. The authorities warned the public to stay indoors, but these men weren't just looking to escape. They wanted revenge, power, and something to prove. As fate would have it, their paths were about to cross. Miles turned. A corner, his senses sharp. A rustling noise caught his attention. A group of men moving in the shadows, their whispers low, their presence unsettling. He didn't react, didn't break his stride, but he knew something wasn't right. The men watched him, their eyes filled with arrogance. To them, he was just another easy target, another unlucky soul walking the wrong street at the wrong time. One of them, a tall man with a scar down his cheek, grinned and stepped forward. "Hey, man," he called out, his voice slick with false friendliness. "Got a minute?" Miles paused, tilting his head slightly. He could see the tension in their stances, the way their hands twitched, ready for action. He could hear their breaths, their excitement, their overconfidence. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Another man, bulkier and meaner looking, chuckled. "What? Cat got your tongue? We're just trying to have a little chat." Miles exhaled slowly, his muscles loose, his heartbeat steady. He had spent years in the most dangerous places on Earth, faced enemies who didn't play games, men far deadlier than these. If they wanted trouble, they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The leader took a step closer, smirking. "What's the matter? Scared?" Miles finally spoke, his voice calm, almost amused. "You don't want to do this." The men exchanged glances, laughter bubbling up. They thought they had control, thought they were in charge. They had no idea that in the next few moments, their world was about to turn upside down. And just like that, the night was no longer quiet. The leader of the group sneered, cracking his knuckles as he stepped closer. The others fanned out slightly, closing in on Miles, their confidence growing with every second. To them, this was just another easy score. Just another guy who would give up his wallet and keep his mouth shut. They didn't know they were standing in front of a man who had faced the worst humanity had to offer, and lived to tell the tale. Miles could feel the tension in the air, the silent communication passing between the men. They had done this before. Maybe not exactly like this, but enough times to know the routine. Corner the target, intimidate, overpower. But they were used to people who panicked, people who begged. Miles wasn't that kind of man. The leader, still grinning, nodded toward Miles's pocket. "Let's make this easy. Just hand over whatever you got. Cash, phone, whatever. No need to make it messy." Miles studied the man's face for a moment, then shifted his gaze to the others. Their body language told him everything he needed to know. They weren't just looking for money. They wanted a reaction, power, control. But they had made a critical mistake. They had picked the wrong man. "I don't think so," Miles said, his tone calm, almost too relaxed. The leader's smirk twitched slightly, irritation flashing in. His eyes, Come on, man. We're being nice. He took another step forward, his hand twitching slightly near his waist. Miles knew that movement. It was subtle, but clear. The man was carrying something. A weapon, most likely. A knife, maybe. Something small enough to hide but dangerous enough to be a problem. The other men shifted as well, their eyes locking onto Miles, waiting for a sign, a moment of hesitation. But they found none. Miles remained still, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, the leader's grin vanished, replaced by something colder. His voice dropped. Last chance. Miles exhaled slowly, his instincts taking over. He could feel the weight of the moment, the shift in energy. They were about to make their move. He had seen it before, hundreds of times. A slight lean forward, a tightening of the jaw, a flicker of impatience in their eyes. It was all the warning he needed. Before the leader could react, Miles spoke again, his voice quieter this time, more deliberate. You really don't want to do this. The leader scoffed. And why's that? Miles didn't answer. He didn't need to. The moment stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, it snapped. The leader lunged. Miles moved before the man even had time to register what was happening. A slight shift of his foot, a quick twist of his body, and the leader stumbled forward, off balance. The man barely had time to process the sudden loss of control before Miles stepped to the side, his hand pressing lightly against the leader's shoulder, guiding him just enough to send him staggering past. The others tensed, their confidence flickering for the first time. The leader turned sharply, his face twisted with confusion and frustration. He had expected an easy victory. Not this. He took a step back, reassessing. He still thought he had the upper hand. Miles met his gaze, steady and unwavering. He had spent years in war zones, in places where a single wrong move could mean death. These men were dangerous, yes, but they weren't the kind of danger that scared him. They were sloppy, reckless, desperate, and that made them predictable. The second man, the one with the bulky frame, took a step forward. He wasn't as patient as the leader. His hands curled into fists, his body tensed. You think you're tough? He muttered. You're just some guy walking alone at night. Miles tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. He could see the anger in the man's eyes, the way his body language shifted. This one wasn't as controlled as the leader. He was emotional, ready to react. That made him easier to manipulate. Leave, Miles said simply. The bulky man barked, out a laugh, shaking his head. You got a death wish or something? Miles didn't answer. He didn't need to. The leader glanced between Miles and his crew, something uncertain flickering in his gaze. He wasn't stupid. He had felt the way Miles moved, seen the ease with which he had avoided the first attack. Something wasn't right, but pride was a dangerous thing. Take him down, the leader ordered. The men moved, their hesitation disappearing under the weight of the command. They thought they had the numbers, the strength, the advantage. They were wrong. Miles shifted, his movements precise, controlled. The first punch came fast, but he was faster. A slight step to the side, a quick redirection of force, and the bulky man stumbled past him, his momentum carrying him forward. Before he could recover, Miles pivoted, his foot sweeping low, knocking the man off balance. The second attacker rushed in immediately after, trying to catch Miles off guard. But Miles wasn't just reacting. He was calculating, predicting. A simple turn of his shoulder, a well-placed grip, and the second man found himself twisted in the wrong direction, his own momentum sending him crashing to the ground. The leader cursed under his breath, his confidence fully shattered now. He reached for his waistband, where a glint of metal caught the dim light. Miles sighed. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this. Before the leader could even grip the handle of his weapon, Miles moved. A sharp, precise motion. His hand catching the man's wrist, twisting just enough to make the weapon useless. The leader gasped. His hand forced open as the blade clattered to the pavement. For the first time that night, fear flickered in the leader's eyes. Miles stepped closer. His voice low, firm. "Walk away." The men hesitated, their breathing heavy, their pride wounded. They had never been on this side of a fight before. They had never been the ones who were outmatched. The leader swallowed hard, glancing at his crew. He could see the hesitation in their faces, the uncertainty. The fight had drained out of them. Finally, with a muttered curse, the leader took a step back. Then another. Without another word, he turned and walked away, the others following close behind. Miles watched them disappear into the night, his expression unreadable. He knew men like that didn't change overnight. They would find another target, another victim. But at least, for tonight, they had learned a lesson. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. The night was quiet once again, but something in the air still felt off. Miles turned his gaze to the shadows beyond the streetlights. He had been so focused on the attackers that he hadn't noticed it before. That faint feeling of being watched. Someone else was there, and they had seen everything. Miles didn't move right away. He stood still, listening. The night had returned to its usual quiet, but something felt off. That feeling in his gut, the one that had kept him alive in the most dangerous places on Earth, was stronger than ever. He wasn't alone. His eyes scanned the darkness beyond the streetlights, searching for anything out of place. The shadows shifted slightly, just enough for him to know someone was there. Watching. Waiting. Whoever it was, they weren't like the others. Those men had been reckless, aggressive, relying on intimidation. But this presence was different. Calculated, controlled. Someone who knew how to stay hidden. Miles exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay relaxed. If they wanted to make a move, they would. If they didn't, it meant they were waiting for something. Either way, he wasn't going to give them the reaction they wanted. Instead, he turned and started walking, keeping his pace steady. He could feel the eyes on him, following his every step. He didn't look back. The city street stretched ahead, the occasional flickering light casting long, jagged shadows along the sidewalks. A few cars passed in the distance, their headlights sweeping briefly over the pavement before vanishing again. Miles turned down a quieter street, the buildings taller, the alleyways darker. If whoever was following him wanted to make a move, this would be the place. Still, nothing. He reached an intersection and paused. The feeling was still there, but it had changed. Whoever was watching him wasn't just following him anymore. They were waiting for him to do something. That meant they knew who he was. Miles had spent years making sure he stayed under the radar. After leaving the Navy SEALs, he had kept his life simple, away from attention. But that kind of training, that kind of past, it never really left. And now, someone else knew. He adjusted his stance slightly, just enough to be ready. Then, finally, he spoke. "You've been watching long enough." His voice was calm, but firm. "Why don't you step out?" For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows. A woman. She was dressed in dark clothing, moving with a quiet confidence that told Miles she wasn't just some bystander. Her posture, her controlled breathing, the way she had positioned herself in the darkness. It was all deliberate. She wasn't an amateur. Miles narrowed his eyes slightly. "You're not with them." The woman shook her head. "No." Her voice was steady, measured. "Then who are you?" She studied him for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. Then, finally, she spoke. "Someone who needed to see what you were capable of." Miles frowned. "Why?" She hesitated. Then, took a slow step closer. Because you're not the only one they're after. The words hung in the air between them. Miles didn't react right away, but his mind was already working through the possibilities. The men who had attacked him, they had been too aggressive, too sloppy. But what if they hadn't been acting alone? What if they were part of something bigger? His gaze sharpened. Start talking. The woman glanced around, her eyes scanning the area before returning to him. Not here. Miles studied her for a long moment. She was careful, cautious. That meant she was smart. And right now, smart was what he needed. Finally, he gave a small nod. All right. They started walking, the silence between them heavy, with unspoken tension. Miles could tell she wasn't used to trusting people, and he didn't blame her. Whatever she was caught up in, it was big enough to make her careful. After a few blocks, she led him into a small diner, one of those places that stayed open late but never had more than a couple of customers. The hum of an old radio played softly from the corner, the low buzz of a neon sign flickering against the window. They took a booth in the back, away from the few other patrons scattered across the diner. The woman sat with her back to the wall, her eyes constantly scanning the room. Miles noticed, but didn't comment. She was trained. The waitress came over, dropping 2 menus on the table. Coffee? She asked, barely looking up. Miles nodded. The woman did too. As soon as the waitress walked away, Miles leaned forward slightly. Talk. The woman exhaled slowly. Those men who attacked you? They weren't just looking for trouble. They were testing you. Miles raised an eyebrow. Testing me? She nodded. To see if you were a threat. If you could fight. If you were someone they needed to worry about. Miles felt a slow, creeping realization settle in. And? The woman gave a small, humorless smile. They just got their answer. Miles leaned back slightly, his mind piecing things together. Who are they working for? The woman hesitated. I don't know exactly, but I know they're connected to something bigger, something dangerous. Miles exhaled slowly. He had spent years dealing with dangerous people. But this felt different. This felt personal. The woman glanced around again before lowering her voice. I've been tracking them for months. They move in shadows, always a step ahead. They don't leave loose ends. But now... She paused, meeting his eyes. Now they know about you. Miles held her gaze. Then they made a mistake. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. I was hoping you'd say that. The waitress returned, setting down 2 cups of coffee before walking away again. Miles picked up his cup, his mind already working ahead. He didn't know exactly what he had just stepped into, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not even close.